Before Superman, before Batman, before Indiana Jones, there was Doc Savage. And if you've never heard of him, that might seem like a rather extravagant claim. Superman is one of the most famous fictional characters in the world. Batman is hardly less famous. Indiana Jones became an international film icon. The Doc Savage? Well, Doc Savage is something else. He's one of those characters who seem to have been hiding in plain sight for nearly a century. He's been a pulp hero, a radio star, a comic book character, a paperback phenomenon, and a Hollywood movie hero. He's been played by Ron Ely. He's appeared on radio 3 times. He's inspired writers, artists, and superheroes. And yet outside the world of pulp and comic book enthusiasts, he's barely known, which is rather strange. Because when you look at what Doc Savage actually is, you begin to wonder how he ever escaped from popular culture. Clark Savage Jr. is a physician, surgeon, scientist, engineer, inventor, explorer, detective, and master of disguise. He's an expert in just about everything. He's also extraordinarily strong, extraordinarily intelligent, and almost impossibly well educated. And he has been trained since childhood to use all of those abilities for one purpose: to help humanity. It's completely ridiculous, but it's also quite wonderful. And the story begins in 1933. The pulp magazines are everywhere. They're cheap, colourful, and packed with crime, adventure, mystery, science fiction, westerns, jungle stories, and increasingly fantastic heroes. Street and Smith already had one enormous success in this world, The Shadow. Now they wanted another. Doc Savage was developed by publisher Henry Ralston and editor John Nanovich, with writer Lester Dent turning the idea into the character who would become the Man of Bronze. Dent wrote the great majority of the stories, but they appeared under the house name Kenneth Robeson. The first Doc Savage magazine appeared in March 1933, and the first story was The Man of Bronze. That title tells you almost everything you need to know. This isn't a modest detective story. Doc Savage is larger than life before you've even met him. But there is an important difference between Doc Savage and the superheroes who would follow him. Doc isn't supposed to have been born with superpowers. He has been made. His father, Professor Clark Savage Sr., spends years preparing his son for a life devoted to helping humanity. Scientists train him. Doctors train him. Teachers train him. He's educated in practically every branch of human knowledge. He develops an extraordinary memory. He becomes physically exceptional. And by the time we meet him, he's essentially the ultimate human being. Or at least the ultimate human being, according to a 1930s pulp magazine. And this is where the Doc becomes fascinating, because he's not really a superhero in the modern sense. He's a fantasy of human potential. Everything he can do is, in theory, something a human being might learn. The stories simply assume that if you trained hard enough, studied hard enough, and had access to enough scientists, you might eventually become Doc Savage. Which, of course, is complete nonsense. But it's a rather different kind of nonsense from Superman. Superman comes from another planet. Doc Savage comes from an extremely ambitious education program. He belongs to an age of scientific optimism. Radio is transforming communication. Aircraft are transforming travel. New technologies seem to appear every few months. The world is becoming smaller. And there is a widespread belief that science might eventually solve almost any problem. Doc Savage is that belief turned into a person. He is science with muscles. And the stories take that idea and run absolutely wild with it. The first Doc Savage adventure has a mysterious inheritance, a lost civilization, a strange poison, a conspiracy, a fantastic weapon, and an enemy attempting to take control of an entire country. And that's the appeal. Doc Savage isn't realistic. It isn't supposed to be. The stories operate at the speed of a fever dream. There are lost races, hidden valleys, strange islands, fantastic machines, death rays, giant creatures, secret societies, and villains with plans so extravagant that they could only really have been invented for a pulp magazine. And Lester Dent was extraordinarily good at keeping them moving. Something happens, Doc investigates. The situation gets worse. Then it gets considerably worse. And just when you think you've reached the solution, there's another problem. And that's Pulp Fiction. Doc himself is surrounded by a remarkable group of specialists. Monk Mayfair, the chemist. Ham Brooks, the lawyer and chemist, who is constantly feuding with Monk. Rennie Rennick, the engineer. Johnny Littlejohn, the geologist and archaeologist. And Long Tom Roberts, the electrical engineer. They're not simply sidekicks, they're specialists. Doc may be capable of almost anything, but his companions each have areas of expertise that make the whole team more effective. And then there's Pat Savage, Doc's cousin. She's intelligent, physically capable and adventurous, and she's considerably less interested in being treated as a damsel in distress than some of the men around her would prefer. Together they give the story something Doc couldn't provide on his own, a sense of camaraderie. Because if you had nothing but Doc Savage being brilliant at everything all the time, he could become exhausting. The Fabulous Five give him people to argue with, people who can make mistakes and people who occasionally have to rescue him. And there is another important part of Doc Savage's mythology, his headquarters. His main New York headquarters is on the 86th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, generally understood to be the Empire State Building. It's a laboratory, workshop, library and command centre all rolled into one. But Doc has another headquarters, the Fortress of Solitude. The fortress is mentioned as early as the first Doc Savage story, although readers didn't actually get to visit it until the 1938 novel Fortress of Solitude. Hidden away in the Arctic, it's where Doc can retreat from the outside world to study, experiment and work in complete isolation. And this is one of those cases where Doc Savage really did get there first. Superman would later acquire his own Fortress of Solitude, but Doc Savage had already established the name and the basic idea. And when Doc Savage finally reached the cinema in 1975, the filmmakers made the fortress one of the first places we see. Ron Ely's Doc Savage begins the film in his remote Arctic retreat before returning to his New York headquarters. So even before we get to the film, Doc Savage has already anticipated one of the most recognisable pieces of superhero mythology. Secret headquarters, fantastic technology, a team of highly skilled companions, and a remote fortress of solitude. Doc Savage isn't simply one of the things that came before the superhero. He's one of the things that helped define what the superhero could be. And Doc Savage escaped from the Pulp magazine very quickly. The first radio series began in 1934, barely a year after the character appeared in print. It consisted of 26 15-minute episodes. No recordings of the original series are known to survive. The scripts survive, the broadcasts are documented, but the actual sound has disappeared, which is a rather frustrating thought. Somebody played Doc Savage on the radio in 1934. Somebody played Monk. Somebody played Ham. Sound effects were created. Music was played. The whole thing was transmitted across America, and then it vanished. Radio would return to Doc Savage in 1943, but by then the character has changed. The second radio series was based on the comic book version of Doc Savage rather than directly on the original Pulp stories, and the comic books had taken Doc in a rather strange direction. In 1941, Doc Savage Comics number 5 gave him something that would have been almost unthinkable in the original novels, a mysterious blue hood with a sacred ruby. The ruby could deflect bullets, while its red light could hypnotize people. Suddenly, Doc Savage was beginning to look rather more like a conventional superhero. Superman hadn't even appeared when Doc Savage was created. Doc had arrived before the superhero had really established its rules. But once those rules began to emerge, different versions of Doc Savage started adapting to them. The Pulp Doc wasn't a superhero. The comic book Doc increasingly looked like one. The radio version followed the comics, and then the original Pulp magazine disappeared in 1949. But Doc Savage didn't, because in 1964, Bantam Books began reissuing the stories in paperback. And this time, Doc Savage acquired another completely different identity, James Bama. If you've ever seen a Bantam Doc Savage paperback, you'll probably recognise the image immediately. Doc is no longer quite the gigantic Pulp strongman of the 1930s. He's a rugged, weathered, bronze-skinned man in a torn shirt, looking as though he's just walked out of an extremely unpleasant fight. Bama produced 62 of the first 67 Bantam Doc Savage covers, using actor and model Steve Holland as the model for his Doc. And his interpretation became inseparable from the character. For an entire generation of readers, that was Doc Savage, James Bama's Doc. The old Pulp hero had been given a new visual identity, and suddenly Doc Savage was ready for Hollywood. The man who decided that Doc Savage belonged on the big screen was George Pal. Pal was one of the great names of science fiction cinema. He had produced and made films including Destination Moon, When Worlds Collide, The War of the Worlds, and The Time Machine. He understood spectacle. He understood fantastic machines. He understood impossible adventures. And Doc Savage seemed almost tailor-made for him. Pal acquired the film rights and began developing a series of Doc Savage films. Eventually, he decided that the first film should go back to the beginning, The Man of Bronze. And the man chosen to play Doc Savage was Ron Ely. Ely was already famous as Tarzan. He had the height, the physique, the athletic ability. And most importantly, he looked like somebody who could plausibly walk into a room and announce that he'd invented a machine capable of detecting thoughts. Ely became Doc Savage. And Doc Savage, the Man of Bronze, deliberately looked backwards. The characters speak in an exaggerated style. The villains are theatrical. The humour is broad. And Doc himself is played almost as though he has stepped out of a 1930s serial and wandered into a 1970s movie. Ron Ely plays him completely straight. He doesn't think Doc is ridiculous. Doc certainly doesn't think Doc is ridiculous. He's the world's greatest scientist, physician, engineer, adventurer, and athlete. Of course he is. Why wouldn't he be? That's the joke. But it's also the character. The film follows the basic story of the Man of Bronze. Doc returns to New York after the mysterious death of his father. There's a strange inheritance, a lost civilization, a mysterious substance, an elaborate conspiracy, and an enemy attempting to use the secrets of the past to gain enormous power. The Fabulous Five are there, Pat Savage is there, and the film tries to reproduce the same mixture of adventure and comic banter that had worked in the books. The result is wonderfully strange. At times it feels like a genuine attempt to recreate a pulp adventure. At other times it feels almost like a parody of one. Perhaps that was inevitable. By 1975, audiences had James Bond. They had sophisticated science fiction. They had television superheroes. They were accustomed to a very different kind of screen adventure. Doc Savage, meanwhile, was still essentially a 1930s fantasy of scientific perfection. Hollywood wasn't quite sure whether to preserve that innocence or modernise it, and the film chose to preserve it, mostly. Ultimately, it wasn't a success. The planned series of films never materialised, and the timing is particularly unfortunate, because only 2 years later, Star Wars would demonstrate just how enormous the audience for fantastic adventure cinema could be, and it was followed up by Superman. Doc Savage had been sitting there waiting for that moment. He had everything: a distinctive hero, a team, a mythology, fantastic technology, and decades of stories. But he had arrived just slightly too early. And perhaps the film's greatest problem was that it didn't really belong to 1975, which may be precisely why some people still like it, because Doc Savage, the Man of Bronze, has something that many modern superhero films have lost. It isn't embarrassed by the idea that its hero is heroic. Doc doesn't spend his time questioning whether being Doc Savage is a sensible thing to be. He doesn't have a tortured origin story. He doesn't really need to discover who he is. He already knows. He's Doc Savage. His job is to help people. So he does. There is something almost charmingly innocent about that, and Ron Ely's performance has become an important part of the character's screen history. For many people who discovered Doc Savage through the film rather than the books, Ely simply became Doc. The film didn't create the franchise George Pal wanted, but it did ensure that Doc Savage had finally become a Hollywood hero. And then he disappeared again, back to the books. Except he still wasn't finished. He went back to radio. In 1985, Doc Savage returned to radio. This time, however, something remarkable happened. We can still actually hear him. National Public Radio produced The Adventures of Doc Savage in 13 half-hour episodes. The first 7 adapted The Fear K. The remaining 6 adapted The Thousand-Headed Man. More than 50 years after Doc Savage's first radio appearances, the character was once again being performed for an audience listening at home. But now the recordings survive. The 34 series is lost. The 43 series is lost. But the 85 series survives. And that seems to sum up Doc Savage rather nicely, because the character had spent nearly a century being reinvented. The pulp magazines disappear, the paperbacks bring them back. The comics turn him into something closer to a superhero. The film gives him a face, and the radio brings him back again. The new writers eventually begin producing new Doc Savage adventures. One of the most important is Will Murray, who began writing new stories in the 1990s. That's quite an achievement, because recreating a pulp character is one thing, continuing one is something else. You have to understand the rhythm, the humour, the language, the exaggerated technology, and most importantly, the optimism. Because underneath the bronze skin, the enormous muscles, and the laboratory full of impossible machinery, Doc Savage is basically a moral fantasy. What if somebody really could become the best human being possible? What if they had all the knowledge, all the strength, all the resources? And what if they genuinely wanted to use them for good? It's the strange thing about Doc Savage. He's ridiculous. He's impossible. He's a fantasy of a human being who has somehow mastered almost everything. But his fundamental idea is remarkably simple. If you have the ability to help people, then you should. And perhaps that's why Doc Savage has survived, not as Superman or Batman, not even as Indiana Jones, but as something rather more unusual. A glimpse of the superhero before the superhero existed. A relic of an extraordinarily optimistic age. And a character who, despite everything, still believes that being the best human being you can possibly be is worth trying. Doc Savage survives as that idea.